Question number 26, overview of inflammation, definition, general features, and causes. Now, throughout the questions that are in the inflammation chapter, you will come across various concepts, including macroscopic, microscopic, and systemic manifestations of inflammation, among many other things. In this question, if you are to pick this question up, you are going to briefly describe these individual concepts and topics of interest. Because you are going to be going in depth anyways, I will try to keep this video concise and as a summary of the important points that you can either use to guide yourself in the following questions, or as a recap of all the other questions once you're done covering them in the inflammation chapter. So, to begin, we need to be able to define what inflammation is, and there was a very good definition given to us by the university itself through their lectures, and this is the one I would recommend you stick to as well. It basically says that inflammation is a phylogenetically fixed defensive and reparatory response of an organism to a noxious agent. And there are a few things within this definition that we need to discuss. The first part being that inflammation is both defensive and reparatory. Please mention this in when you are defining inflammation to the professors, because they love to hear, and not love, they want you to say both defensive and reparatory. Most students just miss out the reparatory part of it and say, oh, it's a defensive mechanism that the body or the host body employs against a noxious agent or stimulus. Please mention both defensive and reparatory. So when we talk about defensive inflammation, this basically encompasses all the actions against the injurious stimulus and is normally seen in response, or caused rather, by live agents. So this includes microbes plus their byproducts. And the basic idea of defensive inflammation is that you want to localize, suppress, and finally eliminate the injurious agent at hand, which is normally, like I mentioned, a microorganism. And once this is done, as a result of this, unfortunately, some of the defense mechanisms that are employed, you can cause damage to the organism's own tissue. So there is damage to the tissue in inflammatory response, and of course, if there is damage, you need reparation. And this is where defensive mechanism then is preceded by reparatory inflammation. In reparatory inflammation, as the word suggests, there's reparation of the damage caused by the injurious stimulus, but also by the damage that is caused by the defense mechanism of the organism. And so these are the points you need to be able to mention when you are defining what inflammation is. Another important part that you need to talk about, and as the question suggests, are the causes, or what are these noxious agents that are actually causing inflammation. A few that you should be able to list down includes infections. A lot of them you will already know from microbio, so feel free to mention any example you seem fit. The other important causes you need to know is tissue necrosis, any local trauma, physical or chemical agents, and foreign bodies along with immune reactions can also cause inflammation. And so if you're able to describe all of these things to them, you have done a pretty good job as far as definition and causes go, and then you can proceed to the general features, which we will discuss just now. So, manifestation and general features, we're going to divide this into the macroscopic, the microscopic, and the systemic findings of inflammation, and then give you an overview of the outcomes of inflammation. So, macroscopic signs of inflammation. You probably have seen these Latin words around. I'm guessing they're Latin. And I personally did not really care too much about knowing them in Latin. What's more important is you know what these terms actually mean, because this is what macroscopically what you will see if a certain part or localized part of the body is undergoing an inflammatory process. So you should be able to define this. Rubor connotes redness, calor connotes heat, dolor pain, tumor, and this is not literally a cancerous tumor, it's just the fact that there's a swelling and a devious process going on due to fluid leakage from capillaries. And then the fifth of these macroscopic findings that were added on, functio lesa, which basically means that you have a loss of function. And so a little bit of detail that is important in this case is to understand rather and to be able to list down the key mediators that are involved in causing these macroscopic findings that we can see. And you of course you don't need to mention all of the mediators that I'm going to list out for you, but you should be able to recall the major steps that are leading to these macroscopic signs being seen, and how, and of course mention some of the important mediators. Not all of them, some of them should be more than enough. So key mediators in why we see these macroscopic signs of inflammation. First one is a vasodilatory process, and vasodilation is mediated by histamine, prostaglandins, and nitric oxide. Second bit is increased vascular permeability. Of course, you need some fluids to leak out to be causing that swelling that we discussed. And so this is normally mediated by serotonin, histamine, and some of the proteins that are associated with the complement system. So the ones you need to mention are C5a and C3a. And another important mediator is leukotrienes. Again, you don't need to mention which specific leukotriene or anything of sorts, just that leukotrienes cause it, should be more than enough. And then, of course, if you have a defense mechanism in place, you would imagine that the leukocyte activation and chemotaxis is an important mediator. And so but the few mediators that are responsible for leukocyte activation plus chemotaxis, so getting these white blood cells into the area of where the inflammation is taking place, where the injurious agent is. These include your C5a protein again, leukotrienes, if you really specifically want to know, B4 is the one, and other chemokines and byproducts of bacterial microbes. And that should really be enough as far as macroscopic signs of inflammation go. You don't need to be sitting down and explaining that, first you have vasodilation caused by blah, 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 and then this also results in increased vascular permeability. Just mention that these are the steps. That's all. You don't have to go into detail of what's the key mediator behind it. Just mention them. You don't have to, talk about the entire process as a whole. Vascular permeability increases due to endothelial gaps being formed or stuff like that. That is not part of this question. You will discuss it in more detail if the question stem asks you to talk about it, or if the professor asks you to talk about it. But other than that, no real need to mention it. So try try being concise in this question and get the key points across. Don't really dwell into too much detail up until the professor asks you to. The second thing we need to discuss now are the microscopic manifestations of inflammation. And there are 4 of these that you need to know: alteration, exudation, immune reactions, and proliferations. I'm going to talk about each of them in a bit more detail. I'm just going to tell you their definition, what it encompasses, and what you should be talking about. So, alteration by definition is, actually before I get into that, right, an important point that I need to mention is that in most of these, even though here we're mentioning that alteration, exudation, immune reaction, proliferation are all microscopic manifestations of inflammations, in the resources that the university provides, you will see them being classified or called simply as alterative inflammation or exudative inflammation or proliferative inflammation. Please do not get confused. These are all in one the same things. Whether you say the alteration phase of inflammation or alterative inflammation, it is one and the same thing. There really isn't anything to get confused about. I just wanted to clear that out, as it has caused confusion in some people in the past, and so just wanted to clear that bit out. But anywho, alteration. What alteration really is by definition, it encompasses the regressive changes that occur during the course of inflammation. And so, of course, if you're telling the professor that these are some regressive changes that are occurring in the course of inflammation, you need to know what these regressive changes could be and some examples as well. So, the regressive changes vary. They range from simple dystrophy all the way to necrosis of the tissue. And dystrophy can include any changes that are observed in cellular metabolism. And so examples of these dystrophic changes can include steatosis, hydropic degeneration, and balloon degeneration. And so it may be very normal for a professor to ask you, okay, give me an example of an inflammatory process where the alterative phase of inflammation is more pronounced as compared to the exudative phase or the proliferative phase. And so examples of this would include diphtheric myocarditis and infectious hepatitis. You will get a list, a flowchart that the professors have provided, which has all of these examples for you. I'm just listing a few of them out to provide you with some sort of something to look at, really, more than anything. And that should be it for alteration. The second microscopic finding of importance, and the second step rather, is exudative inflammation. Now we need to be able to differentiate between what an exudate is and what a transudate is, firstly. And so exudation by definition basically means the release of liquids and proteins from blood vessels that are damaged by inflammation. And this can be also preceded by the leakage of, so I put plus minus, red blood cells as well. And so as far as classification of exudative inflammation goes, they can be classified based on the type of exudate that is present. And just to give you a few examples, you can have serous inflammation. Serous is basically classified as an exudate that has a low fibrin content. You can have non-suppurative and suppurative exudate respectively. Suppurative basically, when you hear the word, you should be thinking high amounts of neutrophil in the exudate, dead neutrophils to be precise, because the basic idea is that in acute inflammation, this is normally more consistent with acute inflammation, so please remember that as well. Acute inflammation, high amounts of neutrophils get out of the from the blood into the infectious site, or the site where the noxious agent is present. They try to battle it out. They die within 48 hours, as you know, and they undergo steatosis, which is another important thing. So you should know that pus, the reason pus is yellowish is because it consists of dead steatotic, so that means these are neutrophils that have accumulated fat. That steatotic neutrophils make up pus, and that's what gives it its yellowish color. So that's suppurative inflammation. Then you can have hemorrhagic as well, and you can have fibrinous inflammation as well, just to mention a few examples that you should be able to talk about. Again, you will get a whole list of these, but before I really get into the examples, one other way to classify the type of exudation is also based on its location. And this basically means that the exudation can be either superficial, or it can be interstitial, meaning deep. And so you will have, so just to give you how the examples will work, when you look at when the list is presented to you, you will see that that serous inflammation can take place superficially or interstitially as well, and then you will have examples for each of them. Same thing goes with non-suppurative, suppurative, hemorrhagic, and fibrinous. So just to list a few examples out for you to give you some guidance. Superficial serous inflammation of the serosal surface is very common, so pleuritis, pericarditis would be another one. And deep inflammation, where the exudate is serous in nature, is normally seen in urticaria. As far as non-suppurative goes, examples will include superficial inflammation, once again normally associated with the pericardial lining, so viral pericarditis is a cause. And in the case of deep non-suppurative, deep interstitial inflammation, viral myocarditis would be a cause. Think Coxsackie virus. In this case, suppurative, you can have quite a lot actually. Maybe I can give you an example. As far as suppurative inflammation of like superficial suppurative inflammation, examples can literally include suppurative pleuritis, suppurative peritonitis, suppurative pericarditis, basically meaning it's an acute inflammatory process with high amounts of infiltrates. An example in the skin, for example, could be folliculitis, which is caused by Staphylococcus aureus. Now for suppurative inflammation of deep tissue or interstitial tissue, the two examples that I can think of, and that you should know rather, are abscesses and phlegmons. And you would have heard in the winter semester how your professors wanted you to know the difference between them very well, and so I will tell you the difference as well. Oops, didn't mean to zoom in that much. An abscess is basically a cavity that is produced by suppurative liquefaction of tissue, and this is filled with pus, the cavity. But what's important that you need to know is that this cavity is bordered. That's the important part. It's bordered by fibrin, and this is what differentiates it from a phlegmone, where the inflammatory exudate, the suppurative exudate, has absolutely no borders. So inflammation with no borders, and it can spread out freely. So you really should be able to talk about, rather define and explain the differences between an abscess and a phlegmone as part of examples of suppurative deep interstitial inflammation, right? Hemorrhagic. Now hemorrhagic, an important thing that you need to know is how to and rather not how to, but you should be able to differentiate between, for example, hemorrhagic pericarditis and hemopericardium, right? And the reason you should be able to do this is because in hemorrhagic pericarditis you have an inflammatory exudate plus red blood cells, whereas in hemopericardium it's just free blood, only red blood cells, nothing else. So please do not confuse hemorrhagic pericarditis or hemorrhagic pleuritis with hemothorax or with hemopericardium or hemothorax respectively. Examples of fibrinous inflammation, one that comes up right off the bat, which you will probably be asked to talk about more in detail when you get to it, is the formation of pseudomembranes that you will remember are associated with Corynebacterium, diphtheria, and that's just an example right there for you. And I think that really makes up, this should cover the important bits of exudation. Remember to classify it according to the type of exudate and the location, and then give examples accordingly. I hope this bit was clear. Again, when you get to the microscopic parts and the question that talks about the morphology of acute inflammation, whoever does that for you will go in more detail. For now, this should be enough. One last thing that you should also be able to mention is when you're talking about how white blood cells leave the blood vessels and into the extracellular space where they exert their action, you need to be able to talk about the 3 steps that are involved in this as far as the leukocytosis and the chemotaxis of leukocytes occurs. And so the 3 steps that you should be able to describe, I will just put them down here for you as part of immune reactions before we get in, or rather before immune reactions before we get into it, because immune reactions take place once the blood cells have actually entered the extracellular space. You need to be able to talk about margination, which is basically the lining up of white blood cells against the endothelium. The adhesion, you don't really need to worry too much about the specific adhesive molecules and the adhesion peptides that are present within the endothelium and the white blood cell surface membrane. And then leukodiopedesis. Should be able to describe these 3 things, these 3 processes as part of the white blood cells getting into the extracellular space where they will exert the immune reactions we're going to discuss just next. And so immune reactions, what you're going to really be talking about is you need to be able to differentiate between a specific and a non-specific immune reaction. By now, this really should not be too difficult. So non-specific immune reactions include phagocytosis, complement system lysis, and antibody-mediated or antibody-dependent cellular cytotoxicity. This is basically non-specific cytotoxic reaction that is carried out by the natural killer cells. Whereas for specific immune reactions, this includes the production and the functioning of antibodies, the inclusion of lymphocytes, and cell-mediated toxicity. I'm going to abbreviate it as CMT. And that is pretty much it as far as immune reactions go. And so the last step now of the microscopic findings that are associated with inflammation is proliferation. By definition, not too difficult. This basically encompasses the proliferation and formation of connective tissue, which is a sign of reparation. And so in this, you're going to be introduced to a new term which is known as granulation tissue. And the main form of reparation is by the formation of non-specific granulation tissue. And this is basically a loose jelly-like connective tissue that is rich, a bit of histology you need to remember here, in ground tissue, right? And just a little overview of how this granulation tissue is formed is that within the blood itself you have fibrinogen, right? And when you'd have some sort of fibrin, because proteins do leak out of the blood vessels, fibrin leaking out in your exudate can basically be used now as scaffoldings by fibroblasts, which are the cells that are involved in the proliferative phase, to climb into the area and to climb into the area of inflammation, and into the area of inflammation, and produce an increased amount of ground substance or ground tissue, along with capillary angiogenesis. And this is something that's important: capillary angiogenesis. In non-specific granulation tissue, you will see that there is a presence, and please mention this, there is a presence of capillaries. So newly formed connective tissue with capillaries is what makes up non-specific granulation tissue. And it's important to also know what happens over time with this, and this is a morphology that you should know. So I will write it down and explain what it is. It's quite self-explanatory actually, but yeah. What basically happens with granulation tissue is that over time the tissue will become tougher in consistency. So tougher in consistency, it becomes firmer, becomes harder, and the tissue becomes pale in color. You'll see histologically a decrease in the number of capillaries as this maturation phase takes place, and a subsequent inverse increase in the collagen fibers that are deposited in the tissue, in the granulation tissue. You may have some hyaline changes taking place as well, and this finally then matures to form what we morphologically see as a scar tissue. So this morphology is relatively important. I would recommend that you know this. And so just one other important thing to mention is that, like I said, the most common form of proliferative inflammation is through non-specific granulation tissue, but there are two other forms worth mentioning, so I will do that. And that is one, the respiratory phase can take place through fibrosis, and this basically means that you basically end up bypassing the formation of granulation tissue. The inflammation in this case is normally mediated mostly by macrophages and lymphocytes as part of the chronic inflammatory response, and that you basically, the end result basically of this is that you have simple direct proliferation of connective tissue. And so this is one of the ways. The basic idea is that you have high amounts of collagen deposited without granulation tissue. And then this another type worth knowing, if where we have non-specific granulation tissue, you will have specific granulation tissue. We'll talk a bit more about it just as we get into chronic inflammation to end this video, but for now what you need to know is that specific granulation tissue has higher amounts of modified macrophages, and so you can think granulomas. But what differentiates it, which is the biggest differentiator from non-specific granulation tissue, is that specific granulation tissue is avascular. You should be able to mention this, and so I will highlight it just so we are clear. And so now moving on to the third part, we're done with the macroscopic and the microscopic manifestations of inflammation. The rest of it is going to be really quick, hopefully. So systemic manifestations of inflammation. The things you need to be able to talk about in this section, one is acute phase response. And if you remember this from biochemistry, I believe it was, is that you have certain proteins that are produced by the liver that whose concentrations increase or decrease with respect to an inflammatory process going on. So you can have positive acute phase proteins and you can have negative acute phase proteins. So, the positive acute phase proteins normally serve as laboratory markers of inflammation and include CRP, so elevated levels of CRP, that is, so these will increase. Positive acute phase protein means that the production of these proteins is increased in an inflammatory process. So increase CRP, increase procalcitonin, increase in serum amyloid A, which the complication thus of which, in case you have chronic inflammation going on, a complication of chronic inflammation is amyloidosis. So please remember that. You may be asked this in case you mention it. And as far as negative acute phase protein goes, as far if you're able to mention albumin, and in case if you want to mention another one, transferrin is another one. And another important one that does increase, which also has diagnostic purposes, you'll remember from physiology, is fibrinogen. Fibrinogen, which is diagnostic in the erythrocyte sedimentation. Right, so an acute phase response is something that is one of the systemic manifestations of an inflammatory process going on. The second one is obviously fever, which can be associated by pyrogens. These pyrogens can be exogenous, such as bacterial byproducts, or they can be endogenous, which are basically cytokines that are released by white blood cells as part of an inflammatory response. The ones that are responsible for causing an increased temperature or fever are interleukin 1, interleukin 6, and TNF alpha. Right, that's pretty much it. There's not really other important ones worth mentioning, but just so we drive home the point, other manifestations can include leukocytosis, obviously, and in the case of acute inflammation, you'll see increased amount of neutrophils, so neutrophilia, fatigue, a loss in appetite may also be observed. And so those are the systemic manifestations you should be able to mention. Then moving on to the outcomes of acute inflammation. It really depends on what's happened in this entire process, right? So 4 major ones that you need to know. First, if the tissue damage is minimum, so minimum tissue damage, and the inflammatory process is occurring in an organ which has regenerative capabilities. You'll remember from the videos earlier on that, especially the one I did where we mentioned some tissues having stable cells or labile cells, and obviously this makes a huge difference on how they're able to regenerate and whether or not they can undergo hyperplasia. Hope you guys remember that. So coming back to this, a tissue so if the inflammatory process occurs in a organ which has regenerative capabilities and the tissue damage is minimum with respect to the fact that you have rapid destruction and removal of the causative agent, you will have complete restoration and resolution. And so this is one of the first outcomes of inflammation. And now the second case is that if you have a causative agent that is persistent, and this usually includes infective agents such as pyogenic bacteria, for example. So I'm going to put in bacterias. A result of this can be suppuration, which we discussed as one of the microscopic findings of exudative inflammation. The third outcome is if you have high amounts of tissue damage and these large amount of tissues become necrotic, you have large amounts of fibrin formed as a result of the exudative phase, and the exudate that is produced cannot be removed or digested. Removal plus digestion of the fibrin is very limited. You will end up having reorganization, or rather just organization, plus repair. which is what we discussed as part of the proliferative phase of inflammation. And last but not the least, if the injurious agent keeps on, if the injurious agent keeps on persisting, and it's probably not a bacteria, I mean in some cases it can be a bacteria as well, but if you have the persistence of that injurious agent and then you have lymphocytes and macrophages replacing the neutrophils, so persistent injurious agent, plus lymphocytic and macrophage as well. If you have an infiltrate of these components, you will end up in the state we call chronic inflammation. Alright, so those are the 4 outcomes that are associated with acute inflammation. And now the last thing we really need to cover is just the difference between acute and chronic inflammation. I'm not really going to go into too much depth for it because chronic inflammation is a video on its own. But what I really wanted to know from all of this is how you differentiate between acute and chronic inflammation, some of the key differences. So the first thing is you can classify the inflammation relative to its time frame. And acute inflammation, so acute, putting this in a box, is usually less than 2 weeks with fast progression. Subacute is inflammation that normally lasts from about 3 to 6 weeks, and normally, with some exceptions I will mention, any inflammatory process lasting greater than 6 weeks is normally termed as a chronic inflammatory process. The exception to this, two that you need to be familiar with, are chronic hepatitis, in which we define chronic inflammation as an ongoing process of over 6 months, and the second one being chronic bronchitis, which we describe as a chronic productive cough. So I'm just going to write productive cough, which lasts greater than 3 months in a year for 2 consecutive months. For 2 consecutive years, rather. So once again, chronic bronchitis is the presence of productive cough for greater than 3 months in a month, greater than 3 months in a year rather, lasting for 2 consecutive years. Alright, and just a few other important points to mention about chronic inflammation is that this can be a consequence of acute inflammation. It can be caused by persistent infections. It can be caused by repeated reinfections. It can also be a result of infection by a low virulence pathogen. And features that are very important, the major one that really differentiates it from acute inflammation is that the cellular infiltrate, the white blood cell cellular infiltrate in this case, is lymphocytic plus that of macrophages. So you will see that chronic inflammation is more consistent and more it has an infiltrate of mononuclear cells as compared to when we saw with acute inflammation, which was mostly characterized by the presence of polymorphonuclear cells or neutrophils for that matter, right? And that should wrap up this video. That you will go into more details of chronic inflammation, I promise. For now, this was just a complete overview. There's a lot more you need to talk about in chronic inflammation as is. I am not going to go into it because the video is quite long enough anyways, but just other things just to mention it for you, so you remember to include it in your answer when you do chronic inflammation, is that you should be able to talk about the differentiation of macrophages, the formation of granulomas, the difference between non-specific inflammation and specific inflammation, and just in general the morphologies of the different types of giant cells, or the few cells you will see in chronic inflammation, how they look and how their morphology is. And that should be all.